Are you tired of learning Chinese characters and words only to forget them a day or a week or a month later? What if there were a simple method that would allow you to remember almost everything you learn and that didn't take too much time and energy to use? Well, there is spaced repetition software. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about spaced repetition software and how to use it to learn Chinese. I have used spaced repetition software, or SRS for short, to learn Chinese for at least 1,000 hours, so I know what it's like. But of course, the goal here is to talk about spaced repetition for learning Chinese in general. Before I explain what SRS is and how you can use it to learn Chinese, I'd like to share some personal numbers though, because I think this can be illuminating if you haven't used SRS before. I used SRS to learn almost 30,000 characters and words in Chinese over many years, but still it didn't take more than roughly 40 minutes per day to maintain this knowledge. I'm not saying this to boast. I think anybody with time on their hands and motivation can do this, but I'm bringing it up because the principles underlying spaced repetition software that allowed me to maintain 30,000 words also works for maintaining 3,000 words or however many words it is you're trying to use. Although I do think that spaced repetition software gets more useful the more you know. So if your goal is to learn 300 words, you can probably do that by reading and listening because the words will occur naturally in what you read and listen to. But more about that later. SRS works really well whether you're studying 40 minutes or 40 hours per week. It's very efficient, meaning that you get a lot of bang for your buck, so if you don't have that much time to invest, spaced repetition can work really well to make sure you remember what you learn. So what is spaced repetition and what kind of software is there that relies on spaced repetition? To summarize it really briefly, spaced repetition is a research-based way of spreading out reviews over time to maximize the effectiveness of each review. In psychology, this is called the spacing effect, and it essentially means that reviews spread out over time are many times better for recall than reviews massed together. So essentially, we can review a Chinese character, for example, either by massing the repetitions together or by spreading them out. So let's look at each of these in turn. So spaced repetition would mean that when you've learned a character, you then later check if you still remember it. Maybe first a few minutes later, then an hour later, then a day later, a few days later, a week, etc. As long as you're able to recall the character correctly, you increase the interval, but if you forget the character, the interval is either reset or at least drastically reduced. As a result of this, reviews using spaced repetition usually feel quite hard because you're trying to push the interval as far as possible into the future, so you are able to recall the character, but not so far that you forget it. And this itself leads to longer-lasting memories. The opposite of spaced repetition is massed repetition, so first you learn the character, same as before, but then instead of spreading reviews out over time, you just review the character over and over. For example, if you're trying to remember how to write it by hand, you write it out on a sheet of paper 100 times. As you're writing the character, it will become easier and easier to recall how to write it, and this can give you a false sense of security because you think you know this character very well, which is true, but the question is how long does this memory last? If you're trying to write it again next week or next month, how efficient is it compared to if you take the same number of reviews and spread them out over time? The research here is very clear. Over long periods of time, spaced repetition is vastly superior to massed repetition. Still, even if learning Chinese is a long-term project, you might still be reviewing things in the short term. For example, if you have a test next week, you might want to make sure you know those words. And then massing things together and cramming might actually be superior to spaced repetition. This is something we explored in detail in episode 241, where we compared the pros and cons of spaced repetition and cramming as learning methods, and concluded that both are valuable and valid depending on what you are trying to achieve. In this episode, though, we're talking about spaced repetition, or in particular, spaced repetition software. While the spacing effect itself is not limited to flashcards, vocabulary, or even language learning, software makes using spaced repetition practical. The reason is that while it's possible to keep track of words and characters without a computer, when you last reviewed, when you're supposed to review it again, and so on, this is highly impractical. If you want to use shoeboxes with paper flashcards in them to learn characters and words, that's fine. When you answer something correctly, move them to the right, and when you answer them incorrectly, move them all the way to the left. And then you review each box at a certain interval, with growing intervals to the right. This is essentially a Leitner system, and if you want to read up on this, I'll put a link in the show notes. This, however, becomes very impractical if you're learning thousands or even tens of thousands of words and characters in Chinese, and creating, managing, and organizing your flashcards become a major time sink. Also, you can't really lug shoe boxes of flashcards around with you on, say, public transport or when going to work, so having everything on a phone makes sense. Digital flashcards, of course, also offer other benefits, such as including pictures, audio, and so on, which are tricky to do on printed flashcards. Before we continue the discussion about spaced repetition software, I want to mention that there are other areas where the spacing effect is automatically applied to your learning. For example, if you're reading a lot in Chinese, that is a kind of spaced repetition. You encounter words spread out over time as they naturally occur spaced out in the text that you read. This, however, is not spaced repetition software, and the intervals are not carefully structured, and it's a different kind of reviewing. But if you want to learn more about this, you can check out episode 281. Reading is a lot like spaced repetition, only better. One of the main reasons that people like using spaced repetition software for learning languages is that it's systematic and quite reliable. You will still forget things, but it won't be because they are neglected or because they randomly didn't show up in your review sessions. To see a neat simulation of how spaced repetition software works compared to more haphazard repetition, such as through reading, please check the animation and the YouTube clip included in the written article on Hacking Chinese, or check the links in the show notes. To summarize what we've talked about so far, if you want to learn the basic meaning of Chinese characters and words without spending more time than necessary, spaced repetition software is very hard to beat. I remember what it was like to start using SRS halfway through my first semester of Chinese, and went from struggling to keep track of all the characters and words we had learned and making sure I got them right on the test, etc., to spending less time and nailing every single exam. If you've never used SRS for learning languages, I strongly suggest that you give it a try. It's not for everybody, and not everyone likes using spaced repetition software, but it is extremely efficient. Naturally, there are also some downsides, and many of them are related to flashcards rather than to spaced repetition. And this is something we've already discussed on the podcast. And for more details, you can check out episodes 173, 175, and 176. I also plan to cover some downsides of spaced repetition software in particular in an upcoming episode. Still, the goal in this episode is to talk about spaced repetition software, what it is and how to use it, and for most students I think spaced repetition can be very powerful. Before wrapping up this episode, I want to talk a little bit more about how to use spaced repetition software, so how to get started and some things to keep in mind while using it. The goal here is not to explain all the ins and outs of flashcards and spaced repetition software, but just to point you in the right direction. First, I think it's a good idea to consider what you want to use SRS for. Obvious candidates are writing Chinese characters by hand, which is probably the most powerful application, but also things like reading characters and words and understanding spoken words with audio flashcards. You might want to do some of these, or all of them, or just one of them, and this depends on your goals and what you think you can cover using other methods. Usually a combination works best, so it's not that you should only use flashcards to learn to read, for example. You should combine it with extensive reading, of course. Next up, it's important to choose an app that supports your goals. So if handwriting is your main goal, I think Skritter is a good choice. But if you want to create audio flashcards, then something like Anki is better because it's more powerful and more configurable. If you want flashcards combined with a dictionary, then Pleco works better, and so on. So it depends on what you're after and what you prefer. I do want to advise against investing too much time and energy into SRS solutions that are implemented inside of other resources. So maybe you have a podcast and they have some exercise sections and you can do flashcards on their website. Or perhaps you have a video service of some kind and they also have a flashcard system tacked onto it. These are rarely very good, they are hard to configure, and sometimes you can't even export things properly. So when you want to migrate and use something else, you're basically stuck. But if you use something like Anki, you can move your words wherever you want and continue learning somewhere else. Next up, I think it's useful to not create too many card types, so that would be for each thing you want to learn. You shouldn't necessarily create a bunch of cards for the same thing. So it's not necessarily a good idea to have one card for listening, one for reading, one for speaking, one for writing, and so on. I think it's better to focus on one or perhaps two. So what is the main purpose of using spaced repetition? If it is, say, boosting your reading comprehension, then having reading cards might be enough. And handwriting, as I've discussed many times times on the podcast is something you should think carefully about before investing too much time into. Another thing you should wait a bit before trying to do is to tweak the system or the settings and trying to create the perfect flashcards or the perfect setup for you. This setup does not exist, a perfect one I mean, and creating it before you've even started using it is almost impossible, so don't try. You will end up spending much more time tweaking and fiddling with configurations rather than you will do learning Chinese, and this is not helpful. I also want to caution against using spaced repetition software to learn things you've never seen before. And this happens sometimes when students realize how powerful SRS can be, and then they just take lists, they import them into their favorite app, and they start reviewing immediately without even studying the words or characters in question. They just start the reviewing process immediately. This is generally speaking a terrible idea. Your words should mainly come from things you read and listen to, or perhaps conversations where there might be things you really want to say. They shouldn't just appear on a flashcard for the first time, then I think you're doing something wrong. For more about this, you can check out episode 140, Should You Learn Chinese Vocabulary from Lists? And the general answer then is no. So assuming now that you're using spaced repetition software to learn Chinese, there are a few things I think you should keep in mind. First, make sure you test one thing per card. If you are testing pronunciation and writing at the same time and get one of them wrong, the program can't know which one you knew and which one you didn't, and one of the major benefits of using spaced repetition in the first place will disappear. Next, only add words you really want to learn. This should be self-explanatory, but I've met many students who import or add way too many words that they don't actually need, and they end up spending more time with spaced repetition than they do reading and listening, and this is not good. This is indeed the next tip. Make sure you monitor how much time you spend on flashcards. If you're spending more than 10 to 15% of your total study time, it's probably the case you are neglecting other things you should be doing, mainly communicating in Chinese and reading and listening. You should also adopt an active attitude towards your flashcards, so make sure you delete things you don't need, that you modify things you're not happy with, and generally don't think of a flashcard as a fixed thing, or that your deck is holy in any way. If you don't like it, just delete it, start from scratch, or delete the bits you don't like, or modify them. Finally, don't let the allure of measurable progress fool you. Just because you can see a number tick up for how many words you've learned doesn't mean you're learning Chinese. This is related to other things, and knowing words is just a small part of what it means to learn a language. Most of the other things you actually don't learn from flashcards, but from listening, reading, and communicating in Chinese. So to conclude this episode, I want to say that SRS is not a silver bullet, but it is still pretty awesome. No other method will allow you to learn words so efficiently, and when combined with other forms of learning, especially listening and reading and then communicating in Chinese, it can be truly powerful. Not just for students who have tests to pass, but also for those of you who just want to improve your Chinese. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.